to this Food Day lecture. As you know, this is Food Week, and each year during Food Week we have a speaker. Today we are quite happy to have with us Frank Reckon. Frank is a researcher at World Watch Institute. The last time that he happened to pass through Iowa was when he was hitchhiking and had to drive through at night. And so he didn't have a real good chance maybe to look around. So now he had some time to...
No, you're going to use that against me.
No, not at all.
Not that I didn't want to stay, but...
He says he might try to move out here, or like to move out here rather than being in D.C. He sees a lot of con out here. Something about Frank's background. He did his BA at Harvard in government, and after Kissinger left there, Frank entered, so he didn't have any direct contact. And during that time, he also spent a year in France studying French politics. After Harvard, he moved on and spent a year as a VISTA volunteer in New York City, and later on moved to D.C., Washington, D.C., where he studied at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies with an emphasis on Latin America. And a few years since then, he's been with World Watch Institute, which is a non-profit organization. Most recently, he has co-authored with Eric Ekholm a monograph entitled The Two Faces of Malnutrition. And presently, he's working on a book, or a chapter of a book, with Lester Brown on national security issues other than military issues. And without saying anything more, I'd like to hand the podium over to Frank. And he said that if you'd like to ask questions during his speech, you're more than welcome to stop him and ask questions during or maybe after too. Frank.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here tonight and honored to be one of your Food Day speakers. I'd especially like to thank Brian for inviting me and for the University of Iowa for having me here tonight. University of Iowa State, excuse me? Well, you know, I went through very quickly in the first time. But I really feel less of a food expert than I do of a well-informed, or at least I hope well-informed student of nutrition and its health consequences. As Brian mentioned to you, my colleague at the World Watch Institute, Eric Ekholm, and I wrote a pamphlet called The Two Faces of Malnutrition, which was published in December of last year. The World Watch Institute might be unfamiliar to many of you. It's a private, nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington, D.C., and it receives funding from many private foundations as well as UN agencies. The head of the World Watch Institute is Lester Brown, who was formerly a senior fellow at the Overseas Development Council in Washington, D.C., and the president or the chief administrator of the International Agricultural Development Service at the Department of Agriculture. World Watch has published 11 pamphlets up to the present time, on subjects ranging from nutrition and health, the women's movement, population, food, and agriculture, as well as energy. And I was interested to read in some of our clips in Washington that Ames is one of the only towns, in fact might be the only town, that burns its garbage and uses that as energy in the town itself. I was thinking that if Washington could do the same, we'd probably really have something to talk about as far as energy goes. But President Carter has a long way to go in terms of using Washington, D.C. This is garbage. As a researcher with this institute and as co-author of this paper, The Two Faces of Malnutrition, I would like to share with you tonight some of the insights that we have gained doing the research and in writing this paper. Until quite recently, getting together enough food for people around the world was the main challenge that they faced in terms of their nutritional standards. The problems of overconsumption as opposed to underconsumption were unknown except in small handfuls of countries throughout the world, and only among royalty and nobility did people have more than enough to eat. However, starting somewhat about 100 years ago, the problems of overconsumption began to become important in the world. And at the present time, the problems of overconsumption of too rich or too wretched diet, that is the affluent diet, started to take on increasing importance. And I will review tonight some of those problems related to the affluent diet and as those diseases have occurred, namely the diseases of civilization. Surprisingly enough, the health problems resulting from overconsumption are somewhat similar to the problems of underconsumption. That is, they both result in reduced life expectancy, a reduced work efficiency, and an increased susceptibility to disease. And it's probably fair to say that in nearly every country today, both kinds of malnutrition, the under and the over variety, contribute to more deaths than any other factor, save age itself. Despite the recent record harvests throughout the world, the problems of malnutrition, of the undernutrition variety, have remained firmly entrenched throughout the world. And the reason is they have strong political and economic roots. Basic reforms in the political and economic structure of many poor countries are needed and will only permit the benefits to be seen from adequate nutrition planning, which I will discuss later. Additionally, in many poor countries, many of the local people do not take advantage of indigenous foods because of taboos or local prejudices. As many of you might be aware, there has been a tendency in third world countries, especially in Africa, because of the activities of a lot of multinational corporations, for mothers to switch from breastfeeding to bottle feeding, even when commercial formulas are out of financial reach for many poor families. The latest estimate of the toll of undernutrition around the world amounted to some 460 million people. That is, these people receive less than the adequate caloric intake per day, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization in 1970. And because of some recent drops in the per capita food consumption of people living in many poor countries, this figure has probably increased. Of these, some 1 to 7% of preschool children receives less than some 60% of their minimum daily caloric needs, which is a condition akin to walking death. These children suffer from one disease known as kwashiorkor, which is protein deficiency, as well as a disease called marasmus, which is protein and caloric deficiency. The children especially, as well as the adults in poor countries, suffer from specific vitamin and mineral deficiencies, anemia being one of the most important. Anemia is very widespread in this country as well, according to fairly recent nutritional surveys, and it's quite widespread throughout the world, both because of an inadequate caloric intake of iron as well as from blood flukes and other things which drain the iron, especially in poor children. The figures that we reviewed in our manuscript show that some 5 to 15% of adults suffer from anemia, and perhaps even a higher percentage of children. Another important vitamin deficiency is that of vitamin A. This condition known as xerophthalmia, or literally dry eye, is a condition which especially affects younger children. They are either unable to see at night, have night blindness, or are totally blinded by the condition. And our recent total showed that some 20 to 100,000 children a year are blinded by xerophthalmia only because of vitamin A deficiency. As to the distribution of malnourished people throughout the world, it probably would come as no surprise to you that India is one of the countries leading the list. Of the more than 600 people in India, some 224 million receive less than 3/4 of their minimum caloric needs, and some 50 million receive less than half their caloric needs. In Africa, about 30% of the people south of the Sahara do not receive enough calories per day. Yet in China, a country which was once known to be one of the most important places of malnutrition, has now solved many of its nutrition problems, not according to a lot of experts, because they have increased their per capita grain production, but rather their distribution system has improved tremendously, and they're now able to distribute grain more widely in the country. According to the Pan American Health Organization, Latin America has not made such progress, and at least 10 to 30% of the children in the continent suffer moderate to severe malnutrition. And as you know, the United States and other developed countries is not without these problems of undernutrition as well. Only in the late 60s did many people in this country discover the problems of hunger in our own backyard. And with the congressional interest and the presidential interest, at least shown by President Johnson, we discovered that nutritional problems of the underconsumption variety are especially important among the aged, among the minorities, among migrant workers, and among Indians and reservations. Undernutrition can kill in and of itself. However, it frequently joins up with other health consequences and increases the health threats to poor people throughout the world. Undernutrition has a role in increasing the death toll from immature births. Also, a poor childhood diet of the mother will definitely affect the size of the newborn and its health chances. Take the case of measles. In many countries throughout the world, the fatality rate from measles is up to some 15%, much higher in this country. And if I were to compare the fatality rate or the death rate from measles of Mexico to this country, I'd find that death rate is some 180 times higher for the case of Mexico, and in the case of Ecuador, some 480 times higher. As I mentioned, frequently you find interacting threats from problems of undernutrition, poor sanitation, and improper weaning, which will result in diarrhea in many cases, which is a trifling illness in a country like this one. However, it can be a major killer, and is a major killer, throughout the world. Another problem to which many scientists and researchers have devoted their attention is that of the relationship of undernutrition to intellectual development, a field which is very complex. However, according to the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, there is a definite correlation between early and severe malnutrition and intellectual impairment. You must remember that when a child is first born in the world, the weight of his brain, or his brain, weighs some 25% of the weight of an adult brain, of the weight that he will have when he's an adult. And by the time that child is 1 year, the volume of his brain is some 70% that will be when he will be an adult. As I mentioned to you earlier, the affluent diet has started to spread in this country and in Europe and in other countries throughout the world because of two important conditions which were only attained in this century. That is, we have incomes way above subsistence level, and there is generally a widespread access to productive agricultural systems. Because of this, what is called the affluent diet has spread with great frequency, probably from 1900 to the present. This diet is characterized by a large intake of fat, perhaps an overly large intake of fat and protein, a high consumption of dairy products, of sugar and refined flours, and with a consequent reduced consumption of bulky carbohydrates, tubers, and other whole grains. There seems to be a definite preference for processed food over and above unprocessed food. But by some standards, in fact by our nutrition standards of the 1920s or 30s or 40s, this diet should be a healthy one. It provides sufficient calories, enough protein, and because it provides us with sufficient minerals and vitamins, it has done away with some of the vitamin deficiencies which were so important in the last century and the centuries previous to that, namely vitamin C deficiency and others. Yet the problem with the affluent diet, one of the most important problems of the affluent diet, is that the percentage of, if you look at the breakdown of what we eat in terms of the fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, it will be clear that the fat content of our diet has increased to the detriment of our carbohydrate intake. That is, fats in the United States now amount to some 40 to 45% of all the calories that we ingest. This used to be the figure for carbohydrates, which has now dropped down to about 30 to 35%. There has, however, been a recent trend in this country and in Europe going from the intake of saturated fat to unsaturated fat, which many doctors think is a healthy trend. However, it has probably been counteracted by an increasing rise in the consumption of meat, which now amounts to some 250 pounds per capita in this country, and in Australia and in Argentina, and approximately 200 pounds per capita in Canada and in some of the Western European countries. Quite ironically, the affluent diet is characterized by quite a high total consumption in grains, but the way Americans consume grains is indirectly through eating meat. It's estimated that prime or feedlot cattle has to be fed approximately 10 pounds of grain for it to consume 1 pound of meat. Thus, about 1 out of every 3 pounds of grain consumed in this country is consumed indirectly through our eating of meat. In this way, we lose the benefits of whole grains and gain the dubious benefits of eating a lot of red meat. Sugar consumption throughout the world has increased dramatically, not only in the United States, but in some countries of Latin America and in Asia. Together, these dietary trends have meant a deterioration in the health standards and in the health of many people throughout the world. But it is difficult to say that our health now is worse than it was 100 years ago. I would not make that claim, because at the same time that these degenerative diseases, these diseases of civilization brought on by the affluent diet, have been harmful to our health, there have been other health improvements that have in some ways counteracted this threat. But if we were to look at what diseases are connected with this affluent diet, coronary heart disease is probably the most important place to start. It is now the leading killer in the United States and in many other Western European countries. One out of every 3 people in this country dies from coronary heart disease, and 1 of every 2 people in the industrialized countries today dies of cardiovascular diseases, of which coronary heart disease is one. In the United States, however, the age-adjusted death rates for coronary heart disease have dropped, and they have as well in the United Kingdom. Many people ascribe this trend to an increasing, to the better health services that are now available, the better, especially the coronary intensive units that are now available throughout the country. However, in many other countries in Western Europe and in Africa and Asia, Eric Ekholm and I found that the coronary death rates are rising, and rising very dramatically. In our research that consisted largely of reviewing medical articles and journals, not only in this country, but written in other foreign languages, we found scattered references to increased hospital admissions for coronary heart disease, and for comments and editorials by foreign doctors relating this problem, especially in the capitals of developing countries, in countries like Senegal, in Guinea, in Tanzania, and in India, countries which we normally associate with problems of malnutrition of the underconsumption variety, now are experiencing a dramatic rise in at least this disease of the affluent, connected to the affluent diet. The risk factors in coronary heart disease are many. Cholesterol and fat have definitely been implicated as 2 of the most important. However, smoking, blood pressure, and genetic factors also figure in prominently. As an example of what I mean by risk factors, a 45-year-old American male who smokes one pack of cigarettes a day has about twice the chance of having a heart attack in his lifetime as does a non-smoker. However, the same 45-year-old American male who smokes 1 pack of cigarettes a day and who has a high cholesterol content in his blood that is above 250 or perhaps 300 milligrams per milliliter of cholesterol, together with a high blood pressure, has about 4 times the chance of having a heart attack as does an American without any of these risk factors. It is well known that women suffer fewer heart attacks than men, and only recently have medical researchers unraveled some of the mysteries that surround this difference in attack rates between the males and females. I can go into that later in the program, but I don't think it would be appropriate here to talk about the findings. These findings were actually talked about in the paper after the publication of our paper. Atherosclerosis is one of the important underlying conditions underlying a lot of people who have coronary heart disease. Atherosclerosis is the blocking of the coronary arteries, which frequently leads to coronary heart disease. Cholesterol, and the eating of food products that are high in cholesterol has been implicated as an important factor in atherosclerosis. However, interestingly enough, a high-fat diet, the ill effects of a high-fat diet are compounded when people are put in stressful situations. And conversely, when people in stressful situations, such as people who work in airplane control towers and others, are put on a special low-fat, low-cholesterol diet, their risk of coronary heart disease drops dramatically, even below those people who are not in a stressful situation. So you might be getting the impression from my comments that there are a lot of uncertainties surrounding these diseases, as well as the dietary implications of the affluent diet, and that is correct. However, I think there is sufficient evidence to lead people to believe that there are important factors in the diet which are implicated in these diseases. Obesity is in many ways a companion of coronary heart disease. Many people who are obese suffer higher rates of coronary heart disease. It's still especially prominent among the lower classes in a lot of the developed countries, and it is on the rise again in many of the capitals of the developing countries, as people in the capitals ape the lifestyle and the eating habits of many in the affluent countries. The recent health surgeons in this country, the health surgeon in this country has estimated that some 10 to 20% of all American children are overweight, whereas some 35 to 50% of all American middle-aged people are now overweight. The reason for this is not necessarily that now we're eating more, we're consuming more calories per day. In fact, the reverse is true. If we were to look at the caloric intake of an American man in 1900, let us say, his caloric intake of approximately 3,400 calories a day is about 200 calories greater than that for the average man today. However, the amount of exercise that each American receives each day has decreased substantially more than the number of calories we eat each day. The risk factor for someone who is obese, let's say 10% above the average or ideal weight as determined by many of the life insurance companies, faces a 50% greater chance of premature death compared to someone of ideal weight. Someone 20% above that ideal rate has a chance of premature death some 1.5 times as great. To put the problem in perspective, if I were to offer myself up an example of someone who is about average or ideal weight, let's say, and I were to consume a half a glass of beer in addition to this diet that I would be eating each day, in the course of a year I would gain, by drinking that half a glass of beer each day, about 4 pounds. However, I need never gain that weight as long as I take at least a 10-minute walk. So the problem of obesity, as well as coronary heart disease, should be put in the perspective of exercise as well as the diet. Another important and rising threat connected to the affluent diet is hypertension, or high blood pressure. Again, there are many uncertainties surrounding the actual cause of this disease. However, we have seen, or many researchers have found, that salt intake, the average daily salt intake of someone, has an important bearing on this problem. And in societies which consume little or hardly or no salt at all in their diet, researchers have found that their blood pressures do not increase with age, as do all the blood pressure readings of everybody in a developed country. To put the risk of hypertension in some perspective, if we were to take some 35-year-old American with a blood pressure some 14% above normal for his age and build, we would find that person would have lost some 9 years of life expectancy. For a 45-year-old man with a blood pressure reading about 17% above normal, that person will suffer approximately twice the risk of a heart attack and more than 4 times the risk of a stroke. Scientists also do not understand why hypertension is more prevalent among blacks than among whites in this country. More than 1 out of every 5 black males suffers from some variety of high blood pressure, whereas only some 15% of American whites suffer from the same problem. Diabetes is a disease which has spread very rapidly in this country and just as rapidly in the developing countries. From the research we've done, we think that the affluent diet might be implicated as at least an indirect cause. Since 1900, diabetes has gone from the 27th leading cause of death in this country to the 5th leading cause of death in 1970. From 1965 to 1973, the incidence of diabetes in this country increased some 50%. And even in countries like India, it can be seen there is a definite urban preference for the disease. A rich Indian living in a city would have more than twice the chance of getting diabetes as would his poor counterpart living in the towns. There are basically two kinds of diabetes: maturity onset diabetes and a juvenile variety of diabetes. In the first case, in the maturity onset, it is frequently characterized by a marginal need for insulin, and an insulin which can frequently be supplied by the correct diet. However, in the juvenile variety, which most doctors believe is genetically induced, there's almost always a definite need for insulin injections. So as you can see, the latter variety is mostly genetic. The former, maturity onset, is largely environmental. And the ratio of the genetic variety to the maturity onset is some 1 to 4, and it is decreasing. That is, the maturity onset variety is increasing. In Japan, for example, in the last 2 decades, the maturity onset variety of the disease has more than quadrupled, whereas the juvenile variety has remained somewhat the same for most age groups. Many doctors believe that overnutrition and overeating unmasks the diabetic and increases someone's chances of becoming diabetic. It is further speculated that sugar in and of itself promotes diabetes by making people more obese, and obese people have definitely been shown to have a greater tendency to get diabetes. But also some people think that it puts increasing stress on the insulin-producing system of the body. If I were to connect the affluent diet to problems of cancer, most of you would probably think right away of saccharin or other synthetics that are in our diet that might or might not be carcinogens and that we should be concerned about. However, dietary factors in and of themselves, at least according to Dr. Ernst Winder of the American Health Foundation, claims that diet is implicated in our cancers for up to some 50% for females and 33% for males. These kind of cancers that males and females get that are connected to our diet are of 2 varieties: that of the digestive system, including the trachea and the larynx and the bowels, as well as of the endocrine system, that of the male breast, and for the female breast, and for the male prostate gland. The relation of diet to cancer perhaps has best been described or related and summed up by Dr. John Berg of the University of Iowa. He says, and I quote, "The most plausible hypothesis, although based on extremely incomplete knowledge, is that some components of the Western high-protein, high-fat diet acting in early life make individuals prone to develop these cancers. One could suggest that mankind generally evolved under conditions of prudent, i.e. low-fat and protein nutrition, and that the present affluent diet, from childhood onward, may overstimulate the endocrine system, producing the same effect that one would obtain running a diesel engine on high-octane airplane fuel." It is interesting to note that the same dietary prescriptions that a doctor would make to ward off some of the cancers that I have mentioned, as well as to reduce the chance of getting coronary heart disease, are the same. That is, a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet. Well, what then can countries like the United States and other developed countries and other underdeveloped countries can do to combat these health threats? Well, national nutrition strategies are called for and seem to be very important ways in which governments can do something about these health problems. But anyone who is to study the national nutrition problems around the world will quickly realize that food consumption patterns have many determinants. Economic ones, the forces of the marketplace, religious and cultural ones, like the ones I mentioned to you, which prevent many poor people from eating foods that would be better for them than other foods. And health factors are only one of the conditions that determine food consumption patterns. However, now that doctors and researchers have sufficient medical knowledge to implicate many of the kinds of foods we eat with many of the diseases that we're now suffering from, and now that our agricultural resources are such that we have surpluses and we can afford to pick and choose somewhat of the foods we eat, governments are now realizing that they have the responsibility and, in fact, the need to do something about the food consumption patterns of their citizens. National nutrition strategies have, in fact, caught on much faster in the poor countries, which in many ways have imitated the rich countries with their food fortification and other special food programs for the children in developing countries. But, as I've mentioned, they've only made a start, and there's much to be done in terms of richer countries helping these poor countries with their nutrition plans. But the overall concept of the plan and the integration of the plan into government policy is something that poor countries can teach us about, and not the reverse. The only exception to this is out of the case of Norway and Sweden, which countries have actually begun to have drawn up plans to incorporate nutrition strategies into their government policy, and are now in the and using the resources that were given to them by their government, dramatically increased the soybean production of Brazil that year. And as a consequence, Brazil was able to maintain the momentum or the pace of its economic development through increased agricultural exports. However, the nutritional stress and the nutritional problems suffered by the poor people as a result of their not being able to buy sufficient beans in the marketplace went unrecorded in many newspaper headlines. Without sufficient documentation and nutritional monitoring, no nutritional strategy can succeed. The problem is therefore first of finding out who are the malnourished, whether they're suffering from underconsumption or indeed overconsumption, and what's to be done about it. Perhaps the very fact that the U.S. looked closely at the problem of undernutrition in this country in the late 60s led to the food stamp program and the improvement of people's diets as far as that went. Yet there are many problems in regard to national nutrition planning in the developed countries today, not the least of which starts with the United States Department of Agriculture. On one hand, some of the departments in the agency are actively promoting the consumption of beef and eggs, beef high in fat and eggs high in cholesterol. However, other departments in the USDA are simultaneously promoting the value of an alternate or prudent diet, which is less high in fats and cholesterol. A similar problem exists in Europe, where the European Economic Community has recently taken away the subsidy from margarine, making margarine and butter almost the same price, whereas margarine, because it's higher in unsaturated fats, affords more protection to people who might otherwise suffer the threat of coronary heart disease. Yet the problems of a surplus of butter in the EEC and the mounting butter in the stockpiles of that European community necessitated that change. In the United Kingdom, a white paper, that's going to be very helpful, thank you. A white paper on food and nutrition recently suggested that people in the United Kingdom should eat more meat, more beet sugar, and other products of dubious healthful value. So what then is the answer for the individual? Well, from the reports that Eric and I have read, from the talks that we've had with numerous nutritionists, there has appeared the general outlines of what we call the prudent diet, which can protect from some of the health consequences of the affluent diet, as I've described it. First and foremost, the fat consumption, especially of every American, should probably be reduced to some 30 to 35% of total caloric intake. That means probably reducing the amount of beef and fried foods that people eat. Second, there should be a switch from saturated fats to unsaturated fats, that is, buying less butter and more margarine. Thirdly, men especially should lower their cholesterol intake. Fourthly, the sugar and salt consumption of the average citizen should be dramatically reduced. We've read studies which say that Americans consume more than 10 times as much salt as they need and much more sugar than their daily requirements call for. As a complement to this, there should be higher consumption of whole grains and of starchy, bulky carbohydrates. And finally, and equally important, energy intake should be balanced with energy expenditure. For an increasing amount of calories we take in, we should exercise all the more. As I mentioned, Norway and Sweden have now come to grips with the problem of a national nutrition strategy, unlike this country and others. In Sweden, national exercise programs and a program to increase the agricultural self-sufficiency of Sweden have been implemented with a view in mind of increasing the health of individual Swedes. In Norway, 8 government departments have coordinated their efforts to encourage the population to increase their amount of fish they eat, whereas to hold steady the amount of imported beef that they're starting to consume. There's a definite tendency in countries throughout the world, as their incomes rise, as the Norwegian average per capita income has risen because of the oil, for those countries to consume a greater percentage of red meat. However, Norway is going to try and hold the line on their consumption of meat, and is going to try and switch from milk, high in fat to low fat or skim milk. The arguments for a prudent diet are not only based on health, but if one were to adopt this diet of more bulky carbohydrates, of more vegetables and less red meat, it would be cheaper per year than would a high-fat, high-meat diet. Also, and equally important, it has the chance or the possibility of changing the terms of trade, and of freeing up some American grain, which might then be able to be exported by this country to feed other countries desperately in need of that grain. It's obvious that only an individual can adopt this prudent diet, and ultimately, only the individual can prevent and can forestall some of the health effects of the affluent diet. But it is up to the government of each country to create a structure of incentives and to help that individual onto the correct choices of his food. Thank you very much. Do I have any questions?
What did you say about the saturated versus unsaturated fats in the food and diet?
There should be an increase in the percentage of unsaturated fats and a decrease in saturated fats. Yes?
If you recommend skim milk, what do you want to do with the fat? The cows keep giving it the same way.
Well, there are ways of processing milk so there's less fat in it.
The way is to remove the fat. What are you going to do with it? There's probably food something.
Well, that's a good question. I don't think I have an answer to that one.
Better start out with Holstein cows.
One thing I didn't mention in my talk was that there is now, for the first time, evidence that a change of eating habits, much on the lines of the prudent diet that I talked about, has been attempted in a small community in Finland, in eastern Finland, which has the highest heart attack rate in Finland for its county, and in Finland, which has the highest heart attack rate in the world. Starting in 1972, the people in this rural district in Finland, became so alarmed at the heart attack rate among even their healthy and young males, they called in the government experts or the health department to do something about the problem. The government adopted many of the findings of the prudent diet and tried to first increase the percentage of males who smoked, tried to change the consumption of milk from regular fatty milk to low fat, and then to skip to milk with very little fat. It tried to change the sausage, the way in which the local people made their sausage, which is very high in meat and fat, in fatty content. And what they did was they increased the mushroom content of the sausage and tried different varieties until the local people were content with its taste. Well, the efforts of the health department were successful, and the coronary heart disease rate in that area of Finland has now dropped some 40%, and it has the lowest coronary heart disease rate of all the counties in Finland. As far as I know, that's the only place where it's ever actually been tried on a local basis. Do you have a question?
Wouldn't it be possible in Brazil, where they are now growing a lot more soybeans, if they would be willing to eat soybeans rather than the black beans, they'd actually be better off providing the cooking time?
Well, again, that relates back to the problem of what people are used to. It's very difficult to change people's eating habits once they're ingrained. And the soybeans were all grain for export, and they would probably be higher priced than the traditional black bean that the Brazilian poor could afford.
Do you know anything about the nutritional value of the black beans? How
It's very high in protein. It's a good healthy food.
about what? About the black bean, that
It's
would replaced by the soybean.
I mean, it's the staple of many of the poor people in the northeast of Brazil.
What did you say was wrong with the black beans in the first place?
Oh, I didn't. If I did, I made a mistake.
Are there many cases like that where countries switch to a different product just because to get exports? And then the people, because they can't afford the price, that they a lot of people sort of get left out, but then they might increase their trade.
Well, that's not uncommon. The United States does it all the time. We promote a great deal of tobacco consumption, we try and grow a lot of tobacco, and most of it now is exported. And all of you, I'm sure, are aware that tobacco, smoking cigarettes, is one of the leading causes of lung cancer throughout the world. That's somewhat off the.
What type of measures could you prevent that if there are other countries like the United States or Western Europe with the markets that they want to buy the products, prevent the farmers from raising them?
Well, it's a question of restructuring the incentives and deciding how high a priority the health of your population is going to receive. Traditionally, in poor countries, the health and education ministries, and generally the people who look after the health of the poor country's population, has received very little funding from the central government, which has put most of its money and time and effort into national defense or other areas like that, or building up the economy, building up the heavy industry. And what it amounts to is governments reordering their priorities and increasing the allotment of land and water supplies and fertilizer for people who can grow foods that would be the healthiest for their population. Yeah.
What incentives do you think our government should make to promote, say, the prudent diet?
Well, they can start off very simply by not encouraging people to eat more eggs and more beef.
Say through subsidies or price ceilings?
Changing the cutting, the way in which the meat standards were elaborated was one way in which to do it. Decrease the fat content of prime beef.
They have done that, haven't
Yes, that has been done. That's one example of something that can be done. Setting up price supports for low-fat milk as opposed to regular milk is another, which has been done in Finland and other Scandinavian countries.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you know what about grass-fed beef?
The consumption of grass-fed beef is definitely healthier than that of the consumption of grain-fed beef, because it contains much less fat, and it's something that the government should encourage. That's another example of what you were mentioning.
I was
Yes.
wondering what percentage right now in the beef is grass-fed?
I don't know.
How about taste?
Taste. It's tougher. That's true.
Beg your pardon?
It is tougher, I say. It is.
Depends on the meat treatment qualities, whether you store it or otherwise. And really, appears to be not too much difference in taste in the grass-fed beef. You do notice a few things, like on particular varieties of clover in some of the milks rather than the meat. And it's one factor in its favour. cheaper to produce and go get the.
That's true.
Is it pretty well available? Like, I'm not too sure.
Well, all beef starts out on grass. It's that corn figure is just the last feedlot fattening. And a lot of it is fed to the cattle right there where the corn is. So you're saving energy because you aren't shipping it. It's one way of getting corn to the market, is to put it into.
Well, unfortunately, it has damaging health consequences for people who eat highly marbled or prime beef.
The point is, excuse me, there are a lot of people who don't get much beef at all, and in fact, that's what the food stamp program is supposed to do. But there isn't any information that goes along with the food stamps in most places on how to use them best to buy something.
Yeah. That is true. You have to distinguish between the problems, again, of under and over consumption. I mean, I'm talking about people who eat meat 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times a week. They're the ones who should be especially concerned about their diets and should think of adopting the prudent diet. I'm not talking about people who are too poor to be able to afford meat even once a week.
Or there are people who have sense and don't eat that much meat.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yes.
Yeah, can you comment some more on the role of multinational corporations, especially how they affect food policy and how they affect the whole type of food we eat here in this country? For instance, here in campus, people getting together who are discussing boycotting 2 corporations, Del Monte and IT&T, because of some of their involvement in South Africa. In Del Monte's case for illegally fishing off the coast of Namibia, and IT&T's case for their investments supporting the government, the white government in South Africa and their apartheid policies, and of course also for producing some great foods like
A Wonder Bread for IT&T.
great nutritious foods. Well, what do you see the role of these multinational food corporations and their impact on our present diets, both here and in other third world countries?
Well, I think you could probably answer that question better than I could. Our study did not specifically focus in on that question. I mean, as I mentioned briefly, the problem of breast versus bottle feeding is one which merits 2 or 3 or even 4 pamphlets of the size that we did on under and over consumption. It is certainly true that corporations like Nestle in various East African countries have actively promoted the formulas, the baby formulas, which the poor women in these poor countries can neither afford nor can they properly, nor can they understand properly, so that their children are literally dying of the formulas that are being inadequately prepared for their children. The role of multinational corporations in our food supply is very important. It's very difficult to know where to start in that. I don't know. Many of the major corporations have control in some farms, not necessarily here in Iowa, but in other places. They dictate the forces of the market, the kinds of foods that we eat. But it's very difficult to say that. I wouldn't want to say that there's some kind of corporate conspiracy behind the diet we eat. I mean, I would rather stress the fact that individuals making intelligent choices about the diet are the things that are really going to matter in the long run, and that the important point is to get people informed and knowledgeable about the kind of foods they eat and their health effects, and good things will result from that.
How do you inform them over and above the corporations, though, with their publicity and a lot of money to put advertising out saying product gets this out in one program?
I have food day every month instead of every year. Yes.
Do you have any comments on the textured fibers versus as a protein textured fibers on saturated, polyunsaturated, as opposed to eating meat?
Well, no, I think you've lost me. You mean substituting more bulky carbohydrates, you mean, for meat?
Textured protein fibers.
Increasing the protein content of our diet, you mean?
No, I mean,
You mean using TVP?
well,
Increasing the roughage, you mean, in our food supply?
the vegetable protein.
Well, if that's to be substituted for the consumption of meat, it's definitely a good thing. There are many products now if you're talking about protein substitutes for meat that you can buy. There are many such products now in the market, which I think are quite palatable. I've just recently, a friend of mine just recently gave me a couple of cases of, I think this is the very thing you're talking about, of textured protein, equivalent of meat. There are pictures on the label of this can of being a veggie chop or a veggie burger, and they're pictured as if they were meat because Americans are so concerned about eating meat, but in fact it is textured protein, and it's quite good. And I know that these cans have been analyzed for protein content, and they've been shown to be very high, sufficient protein for a daily intake of an American.
But isn't the cost always very high on these synthetic proteins from soybean?
It is quite high because there's very little production. You don't have the benefits of mass production. The government, again, could step in and promote that consumption and could act to decrease the price. Yes?
Could you go into some of those reasons why women are less prone towards the diseases that you described?
Yes, it appears that women suffer some kind of protection from coronary heart disease, at least dramatic protection of coronary heart disease up until menopause. And after that, their protection is much less, and their rates tend to approach that of men, but doesn't really equal it. And researchers have actually been quite puzzled by this. They think some of the hormones in females that protect them from the high fat and high cholesterol in the diets that men are much more susceptible to. Recently, some findings have shown that there is a certain carrier in the bloodstream, a carrier that takes away the cholesterol from the linings of the blood, which takes the cholesterol out of the blood, called high-density lipoproteins, which, if present in the body in high enough levels, will ensure that a lot of that cholesterol is taken out of the bloodstream and removed from the body, which will protect someone from coronary heart disease. Well, doctors can easily analyze the content of someone's blood for cholesterol as well as for these high-density lipoproteins, and they found that men have lower levels of these protective carriers in the blood, whereas women have much higher levels. But those levels tend to decrease after menopause. And furthermore, for those of you who are very active physically and run every day, especially for people like marathon runners, tests have shown that as the amount of exercise you're getting increases per day, the amount of protection from these high-density lipoproteins will increase, and the amount of these proteins will increase in your body proportional to the amount of exercise you get. This comes as no surprise to many who have found that people who are in excellent condition and who run frequently or swim frequently suffer much less from coronary heart disease and atherosclerosis than other people do.
I wonder how the widespread use of the birth control pill will affect this immunity that women do have, since it does deal very much with the hormones in their body.
That's a good question. I've read a number of studies on it, but there has not been any conclusive evidence one way or the other yet. It's hard to say.
Well, women that are on a pill seem to be more prone to getting heart attacks and
Thrombophlebitis.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Especially women between the ages of 30 and 40.
The risk increases as you get older for the pill. That's for sure.
The longer you use it.
Yes.
Is there any need for sodium and sucrose at all in the diet, except like to make food more palatable, or either brainwash things as it does?
Well, salt contains iodine, which is a necessary. All salt. There are other sources of iodine. That's right. But if you don't have access to those other sources, at least a minimum amount of salt is needed. But as I said, many nutritionists think we consume about 5 to 10 times more salt than we actually need. As far as sugar goes, in Roman times and even in the early Middle Ages and up to the Middle Ages, sugar was unknown. People did not, in fact, eat any sugar. And they were no more or less healthy for that reason than we are today.
Excuse me, but if you don't have sodium and chloride, or chlorine, NaCl, which is salt, you're gonna be very dead.
I didn't say you could get along without salt.
Oh, but I was just curious, I wasn't sure.
Well, you asked about salt, and you said about iodine, which is an additive which is put onto salt, at least in this.
Yeah, but salt, I know, that's true. No, you can't live without salt. But salt is naturally present in foods. You don't need to put salt, especially on your food. It's present in sufficient quantities in food as we eat them, so that people can get along. In almost all cases, I would say that's true. Maybe. If people eat a regular, well-balanced diet, the amount of salt they'll consume in these foods naturally will be sufficient.
Don't we put a lot of salt in our milk too?
Mm-hmm.
Salt, there's a high sodium in milk.
That's right. There is a lot of salt.
If you want to call it high, but as you said, it depends on your diet. You can get tables from the government, from USDA, that now have the salt content and would have information also about how much you need.
That's true. The Center for Science and the Public Interest in Washington, D.C. has something called the Nutrition Scoreboard, which will list many of the foods, or all the foods that we eat every day, and we'll assign a certain value to that food depending on many factors, mainly its nutritional content and whether it's a healthy food and how healthy it is. Oh, they're up there. Great. It's an excellent little book. Yes?
What do you see as future? Do you see a lot of change right now, or is it going to take a few years before people start having proper diets?
Well, I think the changeover from the affluent diet to the prudent diet has already started. I see many hopeful signs. I think there's a general awareness. There was certainly a very great receptivity to the paper that Eric Ekholm and I wrote. And I think, for an example, on the trip that I took today, on the airlines served, instead of the usual, what 10 years ago might have been a hamburger or French fries or very fatty or greasy food, they served a sandwich on rye bread with a whole wheat stone ground cracker and two pieces of fruit, which is something, an example right there that even the airlines are beginning to become somewhat more receptive to these kind of changes. As I mentioned before, the people are generally aware now that the increased consumption of unsaturated fat as opposed to saturated fat is a positive one, which promotes people's good health. And there has, in fact, been a definite switch from butter to margarine. That's another example.
Well, butter fat is a short-chain fatty acid. I don't see how it... Originally, the explanation was that the long-chain fatty acids were bad for you, the saturated ones, and that the unsaturated ones broke up into short chains, and butter's already short-chain fatty acid.
It's the problem. Well,
Yes.
the difficulties got down to
It's a very short saturated.
what degree of polyunsaturation was most healthy, and there's still a lot of controversy on.
Polyunsaturated fat, and is it healthy? That's what I'm getting at.
Well, doctors think that the body is.
Doctors aren't nutritionists.
Well, that is an important point. In fact, that's one of the reasons why our nation's health has deteriorated so rapidly, is that many doctors do not know a lot about nutrition. And equally, many of the nutritionists who do know a lot about the prudent diet and have been, in fact, suggesting the prudent diet are not listened to, or their counsel is not taken. But in answer to your question, I believe that the benefits of polyunsaturated fat that contained in margarine is much easier. The body finds it a much easier time to break those substances down, and they do not collect as easily on the arteries and tend toward atherosclerosis as other people.
Yeah, this is kind of a two-part question, both of them kind of relative questions. Is it fair to say that the health hazards of underconsumption are much more definite than those of overconsumption? And secondly, how much of the uncertainty over the health hazards of the affluent diet, how much can that uncertainty be reduced realistically? Through
Well, the first question is very difficult to give in precise numbers. I did quote the Food and Agricultural Organization estimate that some 460 million people around the world were suffering from various forms of malnutrition from underconsumption. It's almost certain that figure has gone up since it's a 1970 figure. If you extrapolate the trends of people who have hypertension, diabetes, coronary heart disease, and other degenerative diseases that I've outlined tonight, and you look at those incidence rates in the U.S. and West Germany and France and other developed countries, you'll come out to between 200 and 300 million people who suffer from these degenerative diseases. So it's probably still the diseases of underconsumption in the lead, but the gap is narrowing.
It's not which one is more prevalent. It's that the risks of the underconsumption diet are known scientifically much more definite as opposed to those of overconsumption.
I would not say that it's much more definitely now. That might have been true 15 or 20 years ago. Despite the science of nutrition made tremendous advances in the last part of the 19th century, early part of this century, in discovering a lot of the mineral and vitamin deficiencies in our, or potential vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and recommended that, ways to forestall them. The discovery of insulin, the food fortification schemes that took place in this country 20 or 30 years ago, which are still in effect, prevented some of the problems that I outlined in the undernutrition part of the problem. But it seemed that at a certain point, the science of nutrition kind of stopped and felt very contented with itself and kind of gave up on looking at the other side of the question of overconsumption. But I think that balance has been redressed somewhat in the last 10 or 15 years, and that especially with the beginning of a landmark study called the Framingham study of coronary heart disease that was done by Dr. Connell and his associates in Framingham, Massachusetts in the 50s. The study was carried on for about 5 years initially and showed these risk factors that I mentioned, and began nutritionists and others thinking, realizing that there were many factors in our lifestyle and our diet that were implicated in coronary heart disease. And those, the original people who participated in the Framingham study in 1950 are still being followed. And as increasingly sophisticated measures of cholesterol and the relation of cholesterol in the body to cholesterol in the diet, increasingly sophisticated ways of detecting the early onset of heart disease or diabetes, as these have been uncovered, so too the doctors have gone back over many of the people initially involved in the study and have reanalyzed their findings and are beginning to get a much clearer idea of the effects of the affluent diet on our health.
You mentioned cholesterol in the body and in the diet, and I was wondering how conclusive is it that cholesterol that you eat is really that significant in comparison to individual variation in normal differences which you manufacture in the body? Because I've heard different opinions on it.
Well, the body makes its own cholesterol, and many people think it makes sufficient cholesterol. You don't need to take in dietary cholesterol.
Well, I'm just saying that, like, I thought it seemed like I was reading that. It seemed like some were saying that some people might have just cholesterol problems because their body manufactures a really high